The boarding doors are now closing. All right, I think everyone is here. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Expo. I missed it last year. How about you guys? Yeah, it was like, I gotta have my fix. So, my name is Mike Collier, and I'll let Matt introduce himself. We're here to talk about flight dispatch today. Just going to give you a general overview of what it is we do for the airlines. And basically, we just set this up as an open forum. You know, we put, you'll see a menu of topics and subjects come up on the screen here shortly. Just to kind of prompt you for some questions. You know, as Matt and I were kind of discussing this, it's like, wow, how do we approach this? You know, it's just one of these jobs in the airline industry that, you know, not many people know about. You know, so from like the audience standpoint, you know, it's like you don't know what you don't know. So, you know, how do you formulate a question on a topic you're really not sure, you know, what it is anyway? All right, so we'll discuss kind of high-level overview of some of it is of what we do, and then, you know, that as we go, that may generate some additional questions from you guys out there. There we go.
All
so, Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sounds good. My name's Matt Bartels. I'm a flight dispatcher with United Airlines. I've been dispatching since 2008, I believe. Started off at a regional airline known as Compass Airlines. They were flying Embraer 175s for Northwest, then Delta. Sadly, they were a casualty of COVID. They're no longer around. But when I was there, I started off in dispatch and then moved up through the ranks, became a supervisor, an operations manager, then the duty director and running the entire airline. Gave line checks to dispatchers as part of our training protocols. And then we dispatched the Embraer 170s and 175s. Put in my time at the regional airlines, got picked up by a major airline. I was at Delta Airlines for just over 6 years. I decided I needed to leave Atlanta though, so I moved back up north to the Midwest into Chicago with United back in 2020. Having to start all over, I'm just back to domestic dispatch. I was doing international in every corner of the world at Delta, but we'll get back there eventually. So that's me, and Mike, you can go more in your background.
Okay. You know, similar progression, right? So as you'll see, flight dispatchers do have a similar career progression as pilots. So I obtained my certificate all the way back in 1996. That's when we were still using, you know, pencil and paper for flight planning for the tests there. So it's been a little while. So after that, I started with Mesa Airlines in 97, 98. So I spent about 2 years in the Four Corners region, up around Farmington, New Mexico. After that, went to America West, spent nearly 10 years out in the desert with that airline. Of course, that led to the merger, US Airways. Ended up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for a few years until the merger with American. So you can kind of see some of my duties and responsibilities there at US Air. So international dispatch, developed an AQP program for the flight dispatchers while I was there. Became an instructor at US Airways. That continued on into American. So today, I'm primarily a training instructor at American Airlines. I do still work the desk, just not every day. When I do, I'm still qualified as an international dispatcher as well. So along with that says FAA ATS, that's Air Transportation Supervisor, basically like a check airman. So qualified to give like dispatcher check rides, which we have to do. And we'll talk about that here as we go here. So a little bit about what we do. So we do hold an FAA certificate just like a pilot. Right? We do share joint responsibility with the captain for the safety of the flight. Control airline flights according to government and company regulations. We analyze weather. We compute the amount of fuel that's required based on the type of aircraft, the distance, maintenance limitations, and other regulatory items there. We prepare paperwork, sign a flight release. We're also the ones that delay and cancel flights. So when you go to the airport and you see the flight has been delayed by an hour or 2 hours, or we've canceled the flight, so we're actually the group that's responsible for that. And so, don't throw tomatoes or anything. So that the authority to do that is delegated to us through the FAA. Also en route, we are communicating with the crew. So we have the ability to talk to the crew. It's via ACARS, if you're familiar with what ACARS is. It's basically a text message up to the airplane from the ground. They can do the same thing. They can send us a text message back to the ground from the airplane. So it's primarily how we communicate these days. Okay. We also disseminate information to other groups in the airline. So as we're delaying flights, that goes out into the system. Updates the flight times. We're talking to other groups within the airline then as well for any other requirements. And I'll let Matt tell you about the training that's required to get the certificate.
So the responsibilities with the job are immense. We need to have a similar knowledge level as the pilots and the captain as far as the regulations go, aircraft systems, all that kind of stuff. So there is a bit of a training component. Initially, when you start off, you go to a course. There's flight schools, universities, and then specific schools dedicated to giving you your dispatch license. It takes about 6 weeks. Some classrooms are a little bit longer. You need to have 200 hours of classroom instruction. Then you have to take a written exam. If you've ever, any private pilots here? Yeah, so you've had to take that private pilot exam, in the computer room. We have to take the same thing. It's similar to the ATP exam. And then we have to have a check ride, actually. We sit down with a FAA examiner, and then they decide if we're competent enough to hold the aircraft dispatch certificate. So if we are successful, we end up with a nice plastic card like that. It says we are qualified aircraft dispatchers. And then we go and try to get into the airlines and become dispatchers. So usually, unless you're extremely lucky or internal to a major airline, you're going to go to a regional airline, dispatch CRJs or Embraer regional jets, something along that line. For 2 to 5 years is usually about the time you're there. And then you can get on with the major airlines, Southwest, American, United. The cargo carriers, UPS, all them, they're usually looking for about 5 years of experience before they'll look at you. And then, like the pilot's career seniority based. So when I left Delta to go to United, I did so at considerable cost. I had to start all the way over at the bottom and work my way up. But it all comes down to what you want out of life, and just decided that it was worth that investment. So.
All right. So, and along with that, so as Matt mentioned, all of the training that's required just to get the initial certificate. Once we are hired on at an airline, we have to go through a whole training regimen again, right? So that's part of what I do for American. So as we get new hire dispatchers coming into the company, we put them through an airline-specific training course, which is probably about another 200 to 300 hours of classroom instruction. But now we're talking airline-specific. So we talk policies and procedures. We do aircraft-specific training for the airplanes that we fly. Like Matt mentioned, so we have to know the airplane basically at the same level. The captains, we're not flying the airplanes, pushing the buttons, flipping the switches, but we have to have the same systems knowledge. Okay, so if we're planning these flights, we have to understand the airplane at that level. Right, so that's part of it. To keep our certificate current every year, we require a minimum of 5 hours in the flight deck jump seat every year. So that's part of the annual recurrent requirement. We do recurrent training, just like the pilots do. So we, at American, I'm not sure how it is at United, I'll let Matt speak to that, but American Airlines, for domestic dispatchers, we do 3 recurrent trainings every year. If you hold international qualifications, that's an additional day of recurrent training. So Pacific is an additional day, Latin Caribbean is an additional day. So we get into the division-specific training for that. So that's a lot of training days every year, plus the required flying time that we do.
Yep, United's exactly the same. You have your recurrent classes, and then we have modules that we have to go through, computer-based training. And then, the route familiarization, route quality, you sit in the jump seat and, watch the pilots work, because, the whole point of that is when things are going wrong up in the flight deck, you want to know what the pilots are going through so you can kind of think like a pilot, but you're still sitting on the ground so you can be an asset to them and help them through an emergency situation.
Yeah. So also like the pilots, every year they're required to do their sim checks and their training checks. We do the same thing. So once a year we get our desk check. So it's kind of like our check ride every year. So every dispatcher out there, even working from a regional all the way up to top level, it's the same requirements every year. So for the recurrent training and the desk checks and the route checks. All right, so it's kind of where we get into we start fielding your questions now. So we kind of put our heads together and came up with a few topics that tend to carry over well from real world to simulator applications. So we've got like fuel planning, routes, takeoff and landing minimums, alternate minimums, aircraft performance, maintenance, some reliability things we can talk about, air traffic control, of course in oceanic operations, extended range operations, ETOPS. So we're pretty much ready to start answering your questions as you have them. If you have anything up here you'd like to talk about, or if you have anything kind of off menu you'd like to talk about, we're happy to do that too. So where we got our first question here?
Hi. George Winsky. 2 questions. How many flights at a time will a dispatcher be responsible for?
I'll start off with this one. And I would ask, though, if you have any really hard questions, ask Matt. I'm just a training guy. He works the desk. He's way smarter than me. Okay, so I will tell you for American Airlines, it kind of depends on the time of day and the shift that you're working on. For example, like a domestic dispatcher, just kind of working the flights within the continental U.S. The morning, like the daylight shift, runs from about 5 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So during that 9-hour day, we would work approximately 40 to 45 flights.
At a time, that they're en route.
That 45 encompasses everything that we're doing the pre-planning for, okay, and the flights that are en route. So out of that group of 45 flights, we may have anywhere from 10 to 15 airborne that we're watching at any one given time. So it's kind of a multitask function, right? So we're doing the pre-flight planning for a group of flight, and we're also doing the en route monitoring for that group of flights as well. So it's a multitask operation. The evening shifts that come in after that, they don't write or plan as many flights, but they have to take over. We do a handoff. So I turn over the flights that I have to you. You would inherit all of my flights that I give you on my desk. So you're watching all of the flights that are airborne. So you're not planning as many releases, but you're watching more that would be airborne. And then the midnight shift that would come in, they primarily work the flights overnight. That they land the flights that are still in the air, and then they start pre-planning the early morning departures for the next day.
Okay. And then what is the responsibility of a pilot to double check you as a
We're
dispatcher?
50-50. It's a joint responsibility. We're 50% responsible. The captain's 50% responsible for the legality and the safety of that flight. So I'm counting on the captain. It's kind of the 2 heads are better than 1 concept, right? So I'm counting on that captain when he pulls up my flight plan to really go through it and look at it, make sure I didn't miss something. And the captain's really counting on me to kind of do the same thing. The captain is counting on us as dispatchers to hand them a release that's legal and safe, within the planning, right? So they're counting on us to make sure that we're not routing them through closed airspace or volcanic ash or through hurricanes, things like that, right? So it's really a joint responsibility.
Hello, I'm Scott Peterson from San Diego. I've got a question regarding scheduling. Do you guys handle the scheduling, or is that handled by another department, or is that pretty much computerized these days?
What kind of scheduling are you talking?
As far as like airline scheduling, routes, maybe adding new rights to airlines, that type of stuff?
Okay, yeah, so, the airline, it's composed of many, many departments. Us and, network operations, we're responsible for the, dispatch, crew scheduling, operations management, all that kind of stuff. The actual schedule that we publish out to the public that they can buy, their tickets on, that's done by a couple of groups. You have network planning, and they're the people that are looking at where we should fly, where the demand is, do we need to put a 737 on this route, or do we need to put a 777 on this route? So they're kind of coming up with that schedule that we're going to fly. And then you also have, revenue management, who are looking at, the pricing and the times and how much do we charge for the flight at this time versus this time. So that's a little bit outside of our department.
Hi, Doug Leatham from Fort Walton Beach, Florida. What other jobs are there, if any, for people with that particular license? For example, would a corporate aviation department have licensed dispatchers, or being so small, do the pilots do all the flight planning for themselves?
This one, you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Or another example might be something like a NetJets or something where they have
Okay.
sporadic and non-scheduled flying.
Sure. So aircraft dispatchers are required under Part 121 operations, specifically domestic and flag in the U.S. If you get into supplemental operations and then your Part 91s, Part 35s, it comes down to what's called operational control. So 121 domestic and flag, operational control is delegated directly to the aircraft dispatcher and the pilot in command. In a supplemental operation, that goes to the pilot in command and the director of operations, who then delegates that out to what they call them flight followers, which are essentially serving in the dispatch role, but they're not bound to the same rules we are. And then for corporate, they'll have some sort of a flight following position as well. NetJets has something similar. They're not tasked with the same responsibility. More of that falls directly onto the captain himself, but there's still a guy on the ground who's kind of looking out for the flights, and they sometimes have other duties like calling hotels or working on schedule type stuff. So not the same job. It's not a job I think I'd want to do, but it's similar.
Having said that, though, like Matt mentioned, a lot of these outfits, though, they do prefer those folks to have a dispatcher certificate, just so they have that background, and that experience to draw from. So, see, I told you he was a lot smarter than me.
Nah. Where are we at?
Go to the other side of the room. Jay, on the other side.
Okay.
Lee Cohen from Atlanta, Georgia. Do you work hand in hand with ATC? I never realized that you guys are live with the flight and actually track it during the flight. You're not just planners. So do you monitor the flights hand in hand with ATC as far as weather and cautions and warnings? And
Well, really, air traffic control is just making sure the airplanes don't run into each other. We're kind of doing everything else, right? So it's, but yes, we are working very closely with air traffic control. Oftentimes during weather events, air traffic control will publish advisories to us that mandate specific routes for weather avoidance, and just so they can handle the traffic demand through constrained airspace. So in that sense, so we are working directly with ATC in that regard. We are working directly with ATC, for ground delay programs, ground stops, if you're familiar with what those are. So if there's a weather event that's impacting an airport, they may just stop all departures for an hour, or start metering the flow of traffic into an airport. So the airlines are working directly with air traffic control. In fact, I think probably most of the major airlines out there now have specialized positions. For example, American Airlines, we have some of our dispatchers working in positions known as ATC coordinators. So that is their prime duty as a dispatcher, to work that ATC desk as a liaison with air traffic control on behalf of American Airlines. So we do work very closely with ATC, yes.
Hi, Gene Anderson here, local San Diego with this group. 737, calculating optimal altitudes. So is that all computer driven, or how do you guys come up with your altitudes?
So,
Route planning.
Go ahead.
okay. So all the dispatchers now, technology has come so far since, we started dispatching, 50, 60 years ago, however long it's been. It used to be then you took a map and a slide rule and just a general idea of what was going on in the atmosphere. Now our computers, we can put in each individual aircraft, how much fuel that aircraft burns on average, the weight, how the aircraft performs itself, each individual tail number. And that all gets put into the system, and it takes all the forecast winds, and it decides, okay, if I go this way, I'm going to go straight into a headwind if I go all the way up. If I go this way, south of that headwind, I'll burn better. Maybe I can go higher. Or maybe even though I'm going to burn more gas down low, less wind there, I'll get there faster. So it's a better way to do it that way. So it's all optimized in the computer, and then it spits out the what it thinks we should do. Then the dispatcher takes that plan the computer comes up with, evaluates it, and says, all right, I know it's going to be faster if I go this way, but there's all kinds of turbulence here. I don't want to go through that. I'm maybe go here, burn a little bit more gas, take a little bit longer to get there, but it's going to be a better flight plan. The pilots are going to be happy, the passengers aren't going to be bumped around, and it's going to be an overall safer operation to do it that way as opposed to just going with the strict optimal flight plan.
Is there human input?
Yeah, so the dispatcher is the human input to that. So the computer will spit out what it thinks is best, and then the dispatcher is going to tweak that to what they think is going to be the best plan to go forward.
Hi, Mike and Matt. It's Evan over by the doors here. Question from the online audience from Scott. He wants to know about pay scales. How do they compare between the regionals and the majors when it comes to flight dispatch?
Regional pay is obviously going to be a little lower. I mean, it's really kind of an entry level position when you start at a regional airline. So the pay at those levels are going to be lower than what you would find at a major airline. Not sure if you want to get any more specific than that, but I'll just kind of give you a generalization. I would say probably starting pay at a regional for a dispatcher nowadays is probably in the 40s.
35 to 45.
35 to 45,000 a year for a brand new dispatcher just starting their career. Top of scale at a major airline now can't exceed $200,000 a year.
Another question over here.
Hi there, Dave Snyder, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm curious of how the flights get assigned. Do they typically group in terms of what flights you're responsible for? Do they typically group it with a destination where you're familiar with that weather pattern for the day? Or is it common types so you're not mixing all the different types? Or is it a random, here, they just start spitting out in your inbox and here are your different flights from all over domestically?
Sure, so that really comes down to each individual airline's philosophy. Having worked at multiple carriers, I can tell you that, my regional airline, they just split the flights out randomly. So everyone was going to get anywhere from 25 to 40 flights, and I could have anything. At Delta, they actually regionalized it. So there was one desk that was working, Atlanta to maybe the Mid-Atlantic, and they had, Norfolk and Newport News, DCA, all that kind of stuff. And he might be getting beaten up that day because there's weather, and then there's some guy who's working the San Diego to LA to San Fran flights, and he's got his feet up all day. Whereas at United, the way we do it is we split it by the coasts. So we have East Coast desks, we have West Coast desks, but it's not assigned specifically by the region. So on an East Coast desk, I could have a lot of Newark to Florida or Chicago to New York. It doesn't matter. Those are all randomly assigned, so they know where the line is, and I'm just going to get a random assignment of flights. But I'm not going to get anything that's doing the West Coast because I'm not on the West Coast desk. So it really comes down to how each individual airline wants to split up the workload.
Yeah. So American Airlines does something similar. We're, pre-merger at U.S. Airways, it was all based on line of flying. So a desk would have a, set of airplanes, and wherever that aircraft was scheduled to go, we would just follow the airplane that day through that series of flights. Now at American, post-merger, it's set up in a similar fashion, so it's kind of regional, right? So we have groupings of desks that work, like the Northwest, Southwest, Midwest, East Coast. The international flights are grouped by division. So each desk, like the Pacific Division will work, Australia, Asia, Hawaii, Latin Caribbean, that region of the world. So it's grouped that way.
Seb Montes from San Antonio. Computers have become so powerful, I think we've gotten really good at forecasting the weather. Despite that, are you ever surprised by the weather where you have to make short notice changes?
Every day. Every day. And I mean, Matt would probably say the same thing. Yeah, you're right. The weather forecasting tools are getting better. The look-ahead radar, some of the look-ahead tools are getting better, but I mean, it's still not an exact science. We can get pretty good, right? So we can kind of see where the weather is, where they think the weather's going to be, and we can kind of plan accordingly. But sometimes things happen. So occasionally, that's why we put a little additional fuel on, for that reason. We have a little extra gas there in case we need to deviate a little farther north, a little farther south, or fly higher, fly lower. So we do have to consider that, as part of our planning. So.
Pat Fuge here. Got about 30 questions. In line with computers, do you see your job going away because of AI?
No, and I'll tell you. Just the short answer, no. I'll tell you why. Because we're talking about all this flight planning, right? And I'm sure Matt would attest to this as well. It's really, we spend all this time putting together the paperwork and transmitting it out, making sure it's all safe and legal and all of that. But that's about that much of what we do. This much of it is actually monitoring the flight, looking out ahead of the airplane, just the whole safety of flight aspect, just for the flight monitoring portion of it. And that's where you can't replace human beings for that, right? So, a computer's not going to be able to, evaluate, the weather 300 miles or out in front of the airplane, or evaluate the weather, or maybe some closed airspace, due to, some kind of a political situation, So you always have to have that human element there, just to be able to do that. If you have a medical emergency, the crew calls us. The crew's not going to be able to call a computer on the ground and have the computer set up a three-way phone call with medical professionals, for example.
Most of us use either the fly airliners online use PFPX or SimBrief to generate OFPs. If I was to generate, I get my routing sometimes from FlightAware, and I'll just import it into ForeFlight. Let's say the exact same flight that would be generated by SimBrief, the exact same route. If I generated an OFP with SimBrief, how would it compare to a similar OFP generated by American or United?
I'll let Matt talk about SimBrief and PFPX.
So SimBrief and PFPX, both good tools. SimBrief isn't as robust, in my opinion, as PFPX is, at least from the dispatcher standpoint with formal training. And we know how we like to manipulate things and tweak things. SimBrief doesn't allow us to do some of the things we would like to do. But as far as that OFP comes out, the paperwork you're looking at, that's going to be really, really close to the ones the airlines use. And it's because of the people that are involved with SimBrief. They go out and they look at releases, and then they code it so it looks like the real thing. So when you click on, UAL 18 on SimBrief and you spit it out, yeah, that's going to look really close to the actual product I generate for the real cruise.
Is using cost index and especially D rates, temperature D rates or reduced temperature, reduced D rates. Do you generate the information and does the pilot decide or does the company decide? Who decides what D rate you're going to use or somewhat reduced temperature?
That's really, the performance is really kind of based on temperature and, and the conditions, at the time of departure, right? So, I'll let Matt speak to how United's system is set up, but the way our American Airlines system is set up, at the time the flight plan is, generated and disseminated out to the crew, there is what we call a TPS. It's the takeoff performance system. So it generates the takeoff performance. It's all driven off of the weight of the airplane, runway lengths, runway condition, wet or dry. And there, if it's contaminated, we have to use a different.
That would be my Top Cat then.
Yeah, it's kind of like your Top Cat, system. It's doing a very similar function. But as far as when you're talking D rates, like with the 7.3, it's all kind of driven off of weight.
Who determines what they're going to D-rate?
That's all, at least for Americans, the TPS system, the thrust rating, that's all automated. So it's designed to use the minimum thrust required to lift the weight required. So it's always going to start with the lowest thrust rating possible. So if you're going to start...
Based on a D-rate or assumed temperature?
Well, both, really, because you've got, when you're talking, D rate, so you got like, for the 7.3, you've got 22, 24, 26, 27 for that. So within that, so that would be considered max power. So each, like 22, 24, 26, 27 would be considered a max power setting. Within that, now, if you can reduce that further by using assumed temperature. So 22K is considered a max power takeoff. 22K with an assumed temperature of 40 degrees. So that would reduce that further.
So I guess what I'm getting at is what would I use first, D rate or assumed temperature?
You would start with a D rate and then you would move to an assumed temperature.
Yeah, so the D rate is the 22, 24, 26, 27. And then the assumed temperature is applied to the D rate. Does that make sense?
It does. One more quick last question.
Okay.
Average ISA deviation. Why do you use it for descent forecasting? I don't understand average ISA deviation. On forecasting on a descent, it asks you for average ISA deviation.
I'm not quite sure I understand the
It's
question.
on the OFP. It says average ISA deviation. And in the FMC, on the forecast page, it asks you for the average ISA deviation and the barometric pressure.
Okay, so yeah, what it's asking you for there is it's based on the ISA deviation. It's the aircraft itself is building a profile that it's going to fly, and it knows that when it's hot, ISA plus, so we're above the standard, it's going to perform worse than if it's colder. So it knows that based on the wind and the temperature deviation, how high or low it can get, what its descent rates are going to be. So it's actually programming the optimal descent based on that information. So that's why we need it.
Couple of questions from the online audience. I'm over here in the corner again. Wondering about, first of all, how do you guys measure success? So what does a good day look like for you? How do you know that? And on the opposite side of that, can you tell us any fun anecdotes about days that have just gone off the rails and why and how that happened?
Boy, I don't think we have enough time for that. It's a good day is when the phone doesn't ring. All right, so as we work through our series of flights, right, so if we're working up our flight plans, and we're kind of systematically getting all the paperwork out there in the system, so if I issue my releases and I see my flights push off the gate, take off, and they fly to their destination and land, and I don't hear from anybody, that's a good day. Okay, so on the other side of that, anything can happen. I mean, you just never know. And that's really kind of what makes part of this job, fun, really, because every day's different. You don't know what you're going to get when you walk in the door. Even if you work the same desk for 4 days in a row, day one might be a great day, nothing happens. Day two might be, the wheels might fall off. You may have, medical diversions, weather events, mechanicals. It's really a mixed bag, and I'm sure Matt has got a ton of stories just like I do. So.
Oh yeah, any day you issue a release 15 on a flight is a bad day. But it really comes down to weather and being able to plan ahead of the aircraft. You're going to have your bad days that make you question why you got into the profession, as with any job. But the key to getting through those bad days is to have a good plan and to know what's coming at you. So if you come into work and you sit down and you don't do anything, you just take over your flights, you're gonna be surprised by a lot. If you, even if you're living in the hub city and the drive to work, you see there's thunderstorms, you're like, okay, I'm gonna have a little bit of a rough day probably. So you just have to pre-plan best you can coming into the shift to be able to mitigate any threats that come your way and try to ease how bad a bad day could be.
Another question right here in the center.
Where we at?
My name's Ron Craighead, San Diego, California. So from the beginning of pilot training into the commercial world and crew environment, they teach you about crew resource management, obviously, and aeronautical decision making. So in the airlines, I'm just listening to what you've been saying. I'm assuming that they consider you part of that. Do you actually train as a crew sometimes with scenarios, tabletops, things like that for crises?
We do. It's we actually it's part of our training program is DRM, dispatch resource management. So that's part of that same concept as crew resource management. Not so much lately, but we have in the past. Actually, we've done DRM, CRM with scenarios, live scenarios with flight crews as part of their training program. So we have engaged with that. Just for scenario purposes, just for our recurrent training, we do try to make our recurrent training very much scenario based. Just so it's hands-on. So we're diving into a lot of the non-normal situations that we wouldn't see day to day on the desk. So at times we may not see a particular scenario for months or years, but it's part of our recurrent process. We try to roll that back into our recurrent training, get some hands-on time with it, like emergency procedures, security events, just things that don't come up real world day to day. So we do try to train for that via scenarios.
Yeah, a big part of that is the whole jump seat. A lot of people will question why do dispatchers need to go sit in a flight deck for 5 hours and observe. Well, not only are we observing and seeing how things work, but we're interacting with the crews. We're talking, hey, what are we doing that you like? What can we do better? They're asking us the same questions. When captains go through upgrade training, they bring them through the operations center and they sit down with the dispatcher to see what their job's like. And constant communication between the dispatcher and the flight crew. We're constantly sending ACARs, warning them of threats, just saying hi, giving them football scores. Then the other issue we run into is that DRM, like Mike was saying, huge to have your ears open on the dispatch floor. I'm constantly listening. If there's a dispatcher who's got some sort of an emergency going on, I'm first over to their desk to help them out. Do you need me to take a flight from you? What can I do to help? How can I ease your burden? And the same thing, we're all working similar areas, and let's say O'Hare requires an alternate now because National Weather Service, screwed up the forecast. And I didn't catch it, but someone else says, hey, O'Hare needs an alternate now, and you hear the collective moan from the entire floor. But because we were listening out, we caught that tidbit information to ensure that we didn't make a mistake.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we're not working our flights in a silo, right? So with the way the dispatch floor is set up, so my desk might be here, Matt might be working his desk just as close as he's sitting right now. We talk to each other, right? So like say, hey, did you see Chicago just amended their forecast? Or hey, we got a new segment for turbulence out over the Rockies. Did you guys see that? So we're constantly communicating, make sure we're keeping each other safe and legal as well.
Hey guys, hi. Ray from Tampa, Florida. Very interesting stuff. Quick question, exercising operational control over 45 flights in a shift, right, roughly? Can you give us a picture on how much time approximately do you spend per flight? I mean, the routes are canned, right? So you have multiple routes per city pairs in a way.
Not necessarily.
Give me a picture. Yeah, give me a picture of how that is. I'm curious.
Yeah, it's, I'm sure United's the same. I'll let Matt speak to that then as well. But it's, say if we're going to work a flight from, here to anywhere, back to Tampa, for example, yeah, we do have a database of routes to select from. Some flight planning systems don't use that kind of that canned route system. So that it's just strictly optimizing.
Right.
Best wind route for that city pair. But yeah, right now, yes, we do have the option just to select from that kind of that menu. And there, so but kind of we mentioned when working with ATC, kind of depending on the weather and the ATC picture that day, air traffic control may be mandating that we fly certain route segments. I mean, so in that case, it might not be just a canned route that we can have to just pick from a menu. That might be something we have to go in there and actively construct. And actually build the route in the computer system to comply with that advisory. So once we start doing things like that, now the workload's going up, right? So now it's starting to become more complex. Maybe the aircraft has something broken on the airplane. Okay, that we can
an MEL restriction.
An MEL restriction to where now maybe we're altitude limited. So now not only are we flying kind of a non-standard route, now we're altitude limited. So we're going to have to take that into consideration as well. So the more complex things become, the higher the workload becomes. So then, and don't forget, we still have 12 flights in the air that we have to watch.
Right.
Hey, did you see that segment come up that, that flight's about to run through severe turbulence? Oh, now I was busy building this route. So you really have to keep your head on a swivel. I mean, so it can be a very complex situation. So yeah, but we say 45 flights over the course of 9 hours. So it kind of breaks down, maybe we're actually, kind of building up and planning maybe, 4 or 5 flights, like in a 1 hour period, like for the next hour or 2 hours out. So typically we're working ahead, so like maybe this hour I'm working on flights that don't depart for maybe 3 hours yet, 2 to 3 hours out. So we're not working the flight plan, 30 minutes before the flight pushes. There is a lead time there. So, but kind of depending on the weather and the ATC picture that day, I mean, it could complicate the workload for sure. And I'm sure.
So if we would have put a timestamp to it, about 5-10 minutes per flight, as far as for departures and stuff like that?
That really depends on the complexities of the day. When I was at Delta, if I had a Birmingham to Atlanta flight, the way the flight planning system, the way it worked, provided it was VFR, I'm checking the weather on every flight, NOTAMs, MELs, all that stuff. No issues on that flight. I could probably release that flight in 2-3 minutes. It's the nightmare scenario Mike's talking about here. Yeah, I could be spending 15-20 minutes on that flight. And then you go to the international side. If I'm working a flight from Sydney to LAX, I'm probably spending 45 minutes, hour and a half on that flight just to make sure. But the workload's also balanced out. So on the international desk, you don't have as many flights to release, but the workload for those flights is significantly elevated. But yeah, if you're coming to the presentation tomorrow, we're actually going to walk through how we release a flight so you can see all those steps that we're doing.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. And one more quick question. From a flight crew standpoint, what would make your day a little easier? Is there anything specific that you'd like to see from flight crews in a day of your day operation? No? ACARS message,
he's right.
Give you right,
No.
No, you don't want to hear anything?
No, he said, don't call me. I was like,
don't call.
No,
well, I get a lot of ACARS, how are the rides?
But really,
for example, stuff like
it's
that.
the exact opposite of what he said. The more communication we have, the better.
Okay.
If we're going to, most of the time, we're going to catch if you deviate from flight plan. So if you're deviating, you don't tell us, and we have to catch it, and now we have to evaluate it, and maybe you took a direct you shouldn't have, and now you're routed right into the middle of severe turbulence, or went right into the weather. I spent 20 minutes making a custom route to get you away from.
Right.
So it's all about communication to make our lives easy.
But for the most part, yeah, no. Our relationship, from a dispatcher standpoint, with the relationship with the crews, it's always good. It's always positive. It's we appreciate what they do. I think they appreciate what we do from our standpoint then as well. So for the most part, but it's a pretty good relationship.
Hey, question from the center house, probably going to be the last question from the audience, and then we have one more from online.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Rowan from San Francisco. I was wondering about special use airspaces, and like some procedures are dependent on if some are active or some are not. What is your role in how you guys coordinate that, and are you guys responsible for those changes, or are those changes made on the ground when the plane's getting their clearance?
That's going to depend a little bit on what's going on. If it's a tactical airspace opening or closure that we don't have any knowledge of, we're going to get rerouted around it. They're going to say, yeah, this airspace is closed, you're routed right through it, and ATC is going to give them something to avoid. Most of the time, we know what's active, we know what's hot, we know what's cold, and we're going to stay away from it. So that falls on us as far as routing and keeping away from that hazard.
Yeah, so one of our flight monitoring tools, and you guys use Fusion also, right? Yeah, so we have these, it's an application, it's kind of like a really fancy flight aware kind of an application, right? So it's called Fusion. So we can put all kinds of overlay information on this map, and that's the tool that we use to monitor the flights while they're en route. Okay, so special use airspace is one of those overlays. So it's a dynamic overlay that actually shows whether that piece of airspace is active or not. You know, for like example, just off the coast of California, like going from the Hawaii flights, coming out of like LA, for example. You know, there's a lot of warning areas off the coast there, so we can actually see those and see whether it's active or not. It changes color, so we know if we know if it's going to become active inside of about 2 or 3 hours, or it turns red if it's active. So it's color coded. We can kind of see that. So.
Just give you one last question from the back of the room here from the online audience. Can you talk about, with the recent amount of unruly passengers and the news we're seeing, how does that impact your jobs? How do you get communication from the flight deck, and what type of action do you as dispatchers do to help out?
Unruly passengers. Yeah, that's really nothing new. It's just it's been increased over the last couple of years, right? But we still, over the years we still get the occasional unruly passenger. But there's different levels of what has to happen. I don't really want to get into that. Some of that is kind of security sensitive information, but suffice to say that the crew has the ability to contact us at any time, either via voice, they're on the radio, or a telephone call, or an ACARS message. So they do have the ability to contact us at any time. We will react to that kind of based on the situation. So if we need to, arrange if they have to divert someplace to remove a passenger, we help with the coordination of that on the ground. We have the ability to coordinate law enforcement to meet a flight if necessary. But beyond that, I'm not going to really get into the specifics of kind of the step-by-step of what goes on behind that. So.
Thank you very much, guys. Much appreciated. So Mike and Matt, they'll be back again tomorrow morning at 9:30 in the room next door to do something very similar to this and walk you through a little bit more on flight dispatch. I'm going to take about a 10-minute break now, and coming up at the top of the hour, Nikki from Honeycomb Aeronautical will be talking about how flight simulation can benefit and impact real-world flying. Thank you both, guys, for the great presentation.
Thank you.